again to my podcast and my YouTube channel. Today, we're going to talk to Richard Brockman. He's a psychiatrist and a neuroscientist. He wrote to me, and before we started recording this, I was telling him how much I absolutely loved his book. Because usually, when someone sends me a book, and I get quite a few of those, it takes me a few days to go through it and see if it's really, pertinent and important and beneficial to my audience. But his book, I started reading, and maybe 3 pages on, I said, "Okay, I'm hooked." So it's a yes. So I
Good
was
for you.
really moved and really surprised when I learned that he was a psychiatrist because we do not expect doctors to write well. But then I found out that he's also a screenwriter. And I said, "Oh, that explains it because the way he writes the book is beautiful. It's in a way it's fictionalized, although it's about the loss of his mom. He was 7 years old when he actually found her. She was dead and died of suicide, and that's the reason why he contacted me because he wanted to talk about his experience and, of course, what he learned about his mom when he wrote the book because it does change, doesn't it, the way you see her after you dig in.
Yes.
So this is what we're going to talk about today, his experience and how it affected him as a child growing up. There is a moment in his life when he was a teenager or early 20s, I don't know, but when he actually went and started therapy, he started treatment because he was having a lot of struggles at the time, and that kind of shaped who he is today, and it's a beautiful passage of the book. But Dr. Brockman, thank you so much for contacting me and for the gift of sending me the book. I absolutely loved it, and thank you for being here talking to my audience.
It's really a pleasure, and I look forward to our discussion very
Yeah,
much.
yeah, yeah. So let's talk talking about the book itself. I mean, I've done it. It's people say, well, it's healing. It can be healing in a way, of course it can, but there's so many surprises along the way. I had my surprises. I know you had yours. I was listening to one of your interviews. You were talking about, I think it was Stephen King, who said that if there are no surprises, you're not writing deep enough.
Um,
Is that it?
that's the quote. It wasn't Stephen King. It was God,
It was a
Barry
famous
Levinson.
writer.
Barry Levinson,
Oh, okay. Okay.
who's also a very prominent screenwriter.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
Stephen King said that if you're going to be a writer, it's good to have something in childhood you that just you can't quite deal with and
Hmm.
can't fully resolve. I don't think he meant your mother suicide when you're 7. I don't think he quite meant it on that extreme, but it was Barry Levinson who said, if there are no surprises, you're not writing deep enough.
Yeah, and I love that you mentioned that because I mean I wrote my book and I know and I've written fiction. And I realized when I was writing the fiction book, there was so much of me there. And I read someone said that too. I mean, there is no fiction. There's no true fiction. Nobody
No,
does. You can't just create all of that. There's always a part of you. And of course, in your book, there's a huge part of you, not only. And that's one of the things I loved about your book, the fact that you could intertwine so well neuroscience and the story that you experienced. You know, how you went in and out of these two worlds, being the screenwriter and a writer, and being the doctor who knows why that happens. And it must have been hard, first of all, but really illuminating for you. So tell me about the process of writing this book.
um, when one is writing something that's clearly autobiographical and a memoir, you kind of anticipate that you know where you're going to begin, you know where you're going to end, and you sort of have the sense that you know all the steps in between. What I discovered was that there were a lot of steps that I hadn't seen coming. There were a lot of surprises to me as I was writing,
Mhm.
and a lot of unanticipated observations, discoveries, um, and both through exploring just the narrative, but also exploring the neuroscience. So the neuroscience at times led me to think things must have come from this direction. The
Mhm.
neuroscience is such that it had to come from here as opposed to there. And to a certain degree, let me explore the narrative, but also guide it to a certain degree what the narrative was. So the neuroscience for me was critical, both in terms of writing the book, but also in terms of discovering myself.
Mhm.
It was both part of who I became, but also just the discovery of who I am. But
Mhm.
I owe it to a certain degree to neuroscience.
Yeah, I can relate to that. And one thing that happened to me, because I was in my book, I was interviewing all these scientists too, all these writers and doctors, because I was searching for answers. I was trying to understand what happened to my dad before he died, and what can lead someone to such a drastic decision, right, to take their own life. But what I didn't realize, because I live very much, I used to live very much in my head. So I was trying to make sense of it and have answers, but I wasn't really going, or at least I didn't know that I was going internally so strongly. And actually, I don't know, halfway through the book, while I wasn't even writing the book yet, I was diagnosed with depression. And then I realized what I had done was I was so deep into it, and I was reliving this experience over and over again through others sometimes, because I would interview people who attempted suicide too, because I wanted to understand their minds. But you were saying that it helped me understand who I was, and my your own identity, how it affected you. But was there a time when could you grieve during that process though, or were you like me in your head trying to understand it?
I think my grief was a complicated grief in the both literal clinical sense of that word as well as in the personal sense of that word. I don't think I ever went through a quote unquote proper grief, in part because I never quite accepted that my mother was dead, even
Mhm.
though more than anyone, I think it was clear, it should have been clear that she was dead. But part of my grieving was as yours was with your father, is I needed answers, and I was going to be damned if I wasn't going to get my mother to answer me, and
Mhm.
that became my grief. And it was that process that finally led me through all kinds of passages and transitions in my life, a lot of dead ends in the figurative as well as literal sense of that word,
Mhm. Yeah.
until I finally got to the point of kind of something of not quite an epiphany, but just a realization of,
Mhm.
of just how what I was doing was wrong.
Mhm. Yeah.
Um, and
Yeah.
the question I was asking, the questions were wrong.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
I had to sort of take account of myself, um, and somewhat, not somewhat, but pretty critically in terms of just how wrong I was and not understanding my mother and
Mhm.
blaming her and holding her responsible and holding her prisoner
Yeah.
for
Yeah.
quite a few years. I mean, decades really,
Mhm.
before I realized that. what I was doing was wrong, and then I couldn't properly grieve until I accepted that
Mhm.
and
Yeah,
accepted a certain blame in myself. I mean,
yeah,
suicide's complicated, and suicide in the
yeah.
family, everyone has all these questions and guilt and grief and why did you do this and what should I have done? And it hundreds of questions or
A lot of
infinite,
blame, huh? A lot of
a lot
blame.
of blame, a lot of
Yeah,
and a lot of things that just don't get answered. To
yeah.
a certain degree, one has to accept that you can't finally get
Mhm.
certain things answered.
Yeah, and it sounds from what I read in your book that there was a lot of silence too and a lot of secrets. You said that your father never talked about her suicide, and no one actually told you, even though you found her. But of course, you were 7 years old, you don't understand what happened. They didn't really tell you what happened. So, in the mind of the child, I mean, how did that express itself in you?
Um, that I didn't know finally what happened, even though I witnessed it, and therefore I had to find the answer for myself because my father wasn't going to end. I mean, when he died, to his death, he never talked to me about his wife, my mother, her death, and I think it partly it's the code of silence that just
Hmm.
follows suicide.
Yeah.
But also, I think he loved her. I mean, I not I think, I know he loved her very, very deeply, and her suicide was excruciating for him in a different way than it was for me, but he was unable, both unable and unwilling to talk about it, and indeed
Hmm.
reconfigured his life to sort of eliminate her from his life and therefore from mine, because I was obviously gonna follow him as a
Yeah.
7-year-old. I had to,
Hmm.
and he was trying to vacate her from everyone's consciousness. Um,
And that is so tough because one of the paths to healing, something that really helps, and what I see in my clients and a lot of the people that I've interviewed over these, I don't know, 20 years, is this, like you said, the code of silence, and how, and it happens in other kinds of grief too, how we're supposed to get over it and not talk about the person anymore, like they're gone.
but
But when you're talking about a 7-year-old child, the mother is so much the center of his life. And how can you just say, okay, she's gone? And you were talking about how your father never talked about it and no one really talked to you about it. I remembered a passage of your book. Someone, I can't recall who, but they kept asking you, what happened? What happened? And all you could see was blood, blood.
um, yeah, I mean that gets to a certain degree to the neuroscience of
Hmm.
traumatic memory or traumatic experience, where you both focus on one thing, which means you really don't see other things, and that is in part the way traumatic memory actually works, um, and how that or traumatic perception works, and then how traumatic memory evolves from them. So you don't get a clear understanding. You may have a picture of something or a smell or
Hmm.
a sound,
Hmm.
but you don't have an integration of, okay, given all this data, this is what happened. That doesn't happen, because the integration that memory usually performs in a traumatic experience, an overwhelming traumatic experience, that integration biologically fails. Um, so my experience was very much pieces of memory as opposed to a comprehension. A cognitive comprehension was not there. And it wasn't there until, again, 25 years later or 20 years later.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, again, you're talking and I'm thinking about my own experience and how it affected so differently me and my sister, for example. I have zero memory of what happened maybe 2 weeks after my father died. I really don't remember. I remember the night before, the phone call, and that's it. I don't remember anything. And even throughout the book, I interviewed some people, but this is something that only I can remember. And I still have not been able to remember those days. Even after asking, I know friends came over and I asked them, like, how was I? And even the timing, I couldn't remember if they came before I went back to Brazil. It was just, it's a blur. For me, it's an absolute blur. But for my sister, it's the opposite. I remember you said some things were written in the, it wasn't the book, but one of your interviews, that some things were written in neon, so they're so imprinted in my memory. My sister remembers every second of the few days after his death. I mean, she remembers everything, and I'm a total, nah, wiped out. And I've never been able to remember. It just never came back.
It and it probably won't. I mean, you can integrate it better and think about it more clearly, but in terms of the experience itself, it's not repression. I'm not even sure what repression means, but the psychoanalytic view
Yeah.
of repression and the biological understanding of something that just doesn't get integrated, and
Mm-hmm.
traumatic memory doesn't get integrated. Um, and you can say that's, if you want, I guess you can say that's repression. I would say it's, well, I could go through the neurobiology of it, but it's a failure of biological integration.
Mm-hmm.
So you really can't recall it in any
Yeah.
consistent or meaningful way.
No. No. Yeah, it's the brain trying to protect you against something that is just too painful,
Well,
right?
it's that, but it's also when it's the memory of threat. When you are seriously threatened, in you're facing a lion in the jungle,
Mm-hmm.
or whatever, or you're faced with your father's death, or you're faced with your mother's death, and it's a serious threat. I mean, that's it's not like a problem; it's a threat,
Mm-hmm.
and it's an overwhelming threat. That so if, let's just say, in an evolutionary context, it's a predator, a big predator, that's
Yeah.
attacking you.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you don't want to think a whole lot about what to do. You just want to do something really fast, and either it works or it doesn't work. And that's kind of the basis of the evolution of threat, of one's perception of threat. So
Mm-hmm.
the capacity to think about it, um, about overwhelming threat, is that wasn't evolution's idea. It's when you're faced with evolution's with when you're faced with overwhelming threat, you just want to do something fast,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
um, and you don't need to integrate what's going on because that just slows things down.
Yeah, makes sense. Yeah. Well, let's talk about your mom, Ruth. Let's
Really.
give her a name. Um, she had really severe postpartum depression.
Yes.
And in your book, you talk about, and I'm sure that this happens with postpartum. It might happen quite commonly. You tell me, you're the doctor, but the fact that right after you were born, in the book, you talk about how the nurse called in a doctor to see if she was fit to leave the hospital because she wouldn't hold you and she wouldn't feed you, and you were crying a lot. And the doctor, it seemed like he was a very tactful, very careful in talking to her and say, do you want to hold him? You can hold your baby. And she kept saying, no, I'm afraid of that. I will drop him. I might drop him. I don't want to hold him. So he cries a lot and he's crying, The doctor said, "Yeah, that's he needs to be fed. He needs food." And she would say something like, "Yeah, but he won't stop crying. There's nothing I can do to help." So this confusion, the mental confusion of postpartum depression, is that a common thing? And is this something that you learn from whom did you learn that?
Well, I learned that from studying postpartum depression. I mean, I didn't know this as an infant, you
Yeah,
know.
yeah, yeah. But did anyone tell you that that's what happened in the room?
Oh, yes. I mean, I was told by any number of people how depressed she was and
Mm,
how she wasn't a quote unquote good mother, that she couldn't functionally mother. And that's part of postpartum depression, is that the woman is incapable of mounting the responses that motherhood demands and
mhm,
biologically normally provides. She all those systems failed, and they do fail in postpartum depression, and other systems take over. Um, Mainly the systems of biological depression.
mhm,
So that I knew about from my aunts, from my sisters who were
mhm,
much older than I. And so I learned about what her behavior was like as far as they reported it to me. And then at that point in time, I was sort of a doctor, so I was investigating what that
mhm.
meant. And also I knew that she had ECT, shock therapy, within months after my birth,
Mhm.
which um, I know to a certain degree shock therapy is controversial, but I think it it was critical, and it was the right choice.
Mhm.
Back in this was in the late 50s, early 1960s, and there
It
weren't
was
other,
a common price then, practice then, right?
it was fairly common. It was more, but it also there weren't other choices, other than to do nothing, which um, would not have been a good thing. I mean, she was
Mhm.
very sick.
Yeah. And from what you said, the ECT, the electroshock, it affected her memory. And when she came back, she didn't recognize you as her son.
Yeah, I mean, and again, obviously, this is not some. I would have been 3 or 4 months old. That is not something I'm remembering, but it
Mhm.
was something I was told, and it was more like people would, particularly my aunt, my mother's sister, got very involved in my care at that time, described what was happening, and I could make sense of it as 30 years later, 25 years later, of, oh, so that's what was happening.
Mm.
She didn't really remember things, and that's totally consistent with shock therapy. Is that you have what's called antegrade and retrograde, but you have a certain loss of memory for several months prior to the shock therapy, and for a somewhat less period of time, but also for events going forward.
Mhm.
Your brain does not integrate new experience and doesn't really remember, 4 or 5 months before and after. There's really very little memory.
Mhm. Yeah, it's a sad but a beautiful passage too in your book when she looks at you, and I think it's your aunt that tells her that's your son. That's Richard. That's your son. It's
The neighbor, but
beautiful.
yes,
That's a neighbor. Was
it,
it Katie? Is that her name? Katie?
Katie Galtz,
Yeah, you
who
talk a
was
lot about Katie. Yeah.
Katie Galtz. There were a number of, I was lucky. I mean, there were four very strong, very wonderful women who, I call them a fire brigade, but who came to my rescue
Mhm.
because my mother was not functioning for
Yeah.
quite some time. And Katie Galtz, the neighbor, was one. And she, in my in my reconstruction of that moment, was the one who reintroduced my mother to her son. And
Mm.
it, it, that there's a little bit of my recreation of that, but also her memory was not there. So she probably didn't remember childbirth.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, she was saying how beautiful you were, and Katie told her, oh, well, that's what you wrote,
I mean,
that's
my
your
mother was a
son.
very beautiful woman. I mean, she
Yeah.
was. That I have pictures, I have memories, I have other people's comments. I mean, she was
Yeah.
a stunning,
Mhm.
athletic woman.
Mhm. Yeah.
And that's like, I'm sort of proud of that.
Mhm.
I
Yeah.
didn't know
Yeah,
that.
you say, well, I don't remember, I don't remember. But of course, in the book, you explain how that shapes, the co-regulation, for example, that's so common when you breastfeed. And that's something that didn't happen, and you lose that, and your
Didn't happen.
relationship is different.
Yeah,
And you wrote, my mother's depression changed who she was. My mother's depression changed who I would be.
yeah. Um, that the bond of between the woman, the pregnant woman and the fetus, the bond between the mother and the newborn, um, that it's a critical developmental period. I mean, it obviously goes beyond the newborn. It goes the mother functions as the developing. The brain is still very, very immature when Homo sapiens, when our species gets born. We are very immature. There are
Mhm.
some animals that are born quite mature. We are born incredibly immature
Dependent, like
and
incredibly
dependent,
dependent.
and but not just to be fed and taken care of, but our brains don't regulate on their own. That whole regulatory process is still in its infancy, and
Mhm.
the neonate depends on 99% of the time its mother, his or her mother, but on someone outside of itself to regulate its own function. So
Mhm.
it's more than just being fed. It's regulation of biological systems that the that person, that other. So it's a huge biological interaction
Mhm.
that
Yeah,
occurs, and it's kind of extraordinary
it
how
is.
beautiful, um, and it works. I mean, except when it doesn't work, but most of
Yeah.
the time it works.
What do you remember? Did she get better after that? I mean, do you remember her? What are your memories of her as a mom?
I remember she got better, and you know, I had this is where it gets a little hard for me, but I had probably 6.5 just wonderful years with my mother and
Mhm.
being nurtured and cared for and raised. And so, and I remember, I mean, she was athletic, she was energetic. We did a lot of things. We we lived near the beach in Brooklyn, and I remember, we'd go swimming, and I mean, I sort of would pretend to swim. I didn't quite know how to swim at that point, but she would take me to the beach, and I I didn't like new clothes. I didn't like new things like new pants, new shoes, new shirts, and I had to just kind of just age them very quickly or beat them up. And I got a new pair of shoes, and it had just rained, and I on the way back, and I was we lived near the school, so I'd walk back and forth or run back and forth to school, and it had just rained, so I would jump in every puddle on the way home from school just to get my shoes dirty and the way I liked them. And when I got home, she challenged me on this, and I lied. I said I couldn't avoid the puddles, and apparently a neighbor had seen me jumping in every puddle, and she I was punished, and it was justified. I was lying, but it was done in a way that I knew I wouldn't do it again, and yet it was critical that I had done it in the first place. So it was
Yeah.
a good punishment.
Yeah. You mentioned these was it fire brigade? Yeah, the women who came and
Right.
took care of you. And I want to talk about Miss Oberfeld. That's
Oh,
another passage that I copied here, and I want to read that one because when you turned 7, and that was the year your mom died, she forgot your birthday, which, of course, for the child is traumatizing in itself, right? But then your teacher remembered. And I want to read that passage, okay?
okay.
On my 7th birthday, Miss Oberfeld brought out the papier mache cake and sang happy birthday. Then she gave me a big hug, which I liked a lot. And she said, make a wish. It's your birthday. What do you want for your birthday? I looked at Miss Oberfeld, this woman who was young and pretty and who remembered it was my birthday and who was kneeling beside me. I smelled her hair. I decided right then and there that I loved Miss Oberfeld and I would marry her when I grew up. And I made a wish, and she said again, make a wish, she said. What do you want? And I made a wish without closing my eyes, without saying it only to myself, but instead I said right to her face, I wish you were dead. Miss Oberfeld didn't know what to say. Kids snickered. Then she said, is that your wish, that I was dead? I stared at her. I kept staring. I didn't know why I had said that. And then I turned and ran. How do you see that now?
Um, that got to me, gets to me now. It was such a painful moment in my life that my mother would forget my birthday, and I felt such deep. I mean, it's like I had a crush or whatever you want to call it. I was madly in love with this woman. I was 7 years old, my kindergarten for first grade teacher. Um, and it's clear I was expressing my rage with my mother and the ambivalence of feeling just deep, deep love, yet such profound disappointment at the same time. And the feeling that how could she possibly forget my birthday? I mean, what does that mean about her and about me and life and whatever for a 7-year old? And to this day, I feel guilty. I feel so guilty because I adored Miss Oberfeld.
I'm sure she understood.
I, well, it the passage goes on where I ran out of the school and she comes and finds me. Um, it's it has a resolution that thank goodness there was a resolution, and thank goodness that she was self-possessed enough. I mean, I don't know how old Mrs. Overlow was. She was 25. I mean, she wasn't mature. I mean, she was a young woman. I'm sure it was kindergarten teacher. I don't know. I don't know how old she was. But she was able to understand that something was going on. She didn't know what. I mean, she didn't know what was happening with my mother, but
Mhm.
she was able to overcome that assault. I mean, that was an assaultive thing for a little kid to say to somebody. It was awful. But she just saw through that, and I'm so grateful to her.
Well, I want to marry Miss Oberfeld too.
Yeah, yeah,
She was
really.
fantastic. Yeah, I love what you write after you said, I needed how you interpret that now, right? That moment. And you said, I needed my mother to remember. That's what mothers do. They remember, they put things together. They take things, you tell them, and make stories. And then you have memory, and then you have a story. That's how it works, except when your mother forgets. My mother forgot. Miss Oberfeld remembered. She was the best teacher I ever had. I didn't want Miss Oberfeld to be dead. I wanted to marry her. That's
Um,
so beautiful.
it sort of tears me apart. But there is the biology of story, and the book in part is the narrative of my childhood and just dealing with it, but it's also the biology of narrative and how the biology of story. And one of the things that a parent, early parenting, early childhood, not neonatal, but early parenting does is a child will say things and say words that are somewhat random, and they sort of, cat and ball and house and play, and the adult or the mother will sort of, you went and saw a cat and you were playing with the ball at your neighbor's house, and she puts
Mhm.
it into a structure of narrative and story. And there's obviously a psychology of that, but there's also a biology of putting things together in a narrative structure. That's what an adult does for the child. It makes the experience into a narrative,
Mhm.
and then it gets remembered. Because
Mhm.
if you think about it, when you remember something, you don't remember things isolated. You remember them in a structure, in a story structure.
Yeah.
And good enough mothering, good enough parenting provides that that arc
Mhm.
of story structure.
Yeah. Well, tell me about how your mom's death and what everything that happened affected you as a teenager and young adult. I know you write about there were drugs, you had a lot of self-medication. So talk a little bit about that.
I was a real explorer. Once I got my bicycle, and getting a bike at age 6 was huge for me. It was like, I was about to say like having a motorcycle, but it was like a big deal. It was a huge amount of freedom, and I took full advantage of that. And my parents trusted me to do that. And it was there weren't that many cars, and there just wasn't a place near there where cars were going fast. And all right, I got beat up once in a while, but that was life as a 6-year-old, 8-year-olds will beat you up. It's like, it's okay. You survive. And I saw myself as this kind of adventurer and explorer. And I was, this little piece of Brooklyn where I lived was this world that I was adventuring out into, including Coney Island, which, I don't know if you know Coney Island, but it's a huge amusement park, especially back then. It was much bigger than it is now. And, it was a honky tonk, great place for a kid. And, and then everything crashed. Everything I had constructed, every pillar that I was like, these are solid, these are here, they all crashed. I mean, it wasn't just my mother, the pillar of my mother. I mean, she was the critical foundation for everything else. And
Mhm.
it all came imploded. So I didn't really know who I was. And I didn't know who I was for a long time. And a lot of my exploration as a teenager and into my 20s was trying to figure out who I was, but demanding that she be part of it. And that's where I went off the rails.
Mhm.
Um, I I kept her soul a prisoner, and I'm not saying I was bad or wrong, or I understand it, but it didn't. It was keeping me confused and wrestling with an angel, and it's a wrestling with a soul, and I kept her in prison. In
Mhm.
As I look back on it, because I needed to get an answer from her, and it was like it was futile. But that's what I did. And so I was never suicidal. I mean, I
Mhm.
thought a lot about suicide. And suicide was never far from my consciousness, but I never actually tried to kill myself. But I lived somewhat of a parasuicidal life
Yeah.
where I figured, well, one way to get her to manifest herself was whether she would rescue me.
Mm.
So it was into taking certain risks, not where there's certain death, but where there's risk. And if I died, then I'd go join her. And if I didn't die, it was because she had saved me. And it 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 didn't make sense, but
Yeah.
it really stopped me from dealing with life and
Mhm.
who am I?
Mhm.
What do I want from life? What's my goal in life? My goal was simple. It was to bring my mother and force her to tell me why she did this and did she love me and what was really going on, and to force an answer.
Mhm.
Why did you do it's like with your father. Why did you do this? You're on trial. I'm going to force the answer. Tell me.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it was like I don't even know who I was talking. I thought I was talking to my mother, but
Mhm. Yeah. Dr. Brockman, I have two more questions for you, but one of them, I want you to talk about the therapy that seemed to really have an impact on you. And maybe I'm mistaken, but it kind of, that's what brought you to being a psychiatrist. Because at the time, as you said, you had some self-destructive behavior. And I think was it inpatient treatment that you did?
no, it was at Austin Riggs, which was
Mm-hmm.
near my college. Austin Riggs is an inpatient hospital, but they also have outpatient under certain circumstances. And this was a certain
Mm-hmm.
circumstance that
Mm-hmm.
I think, well, I don't know how it was arranged, but exactly. But the student health service at my college said, I guess, contacted with
Mm-hmm.
Margaret Brenman, who was a really extraordinary therapist. She was a PhD psychotherapist and was actually the first full professor of psychiatry and psychology at Harvard. Um,
Mm-hmm.
the first female full
Mm-hmm.
professor
Yeah.
at Harvard. Um, and that was actually when she left Austin Riggs was when she left Riggs to go to Harvard. Um, I was given the extraordinary opportunity of having her as my therapist. I didn't see it as a great opportunity. I saw it as just, what does this woman want? Who the hell is she? And why is she bothering me?
Mm-hmm.
But she saved my life.
She did.
And and again, it was a time when where Freudian psychoanalysis and other forms of psychotherapy were crossing, if you will. And I had had a little bit of Freudian experience, which I just thought it was ridiculous and rebelled against, and
Mm-hmm.
I thought it was just nonsense. But she was very much a human being for me, and I think she was aware that I needed someone to appropriately I was at that point 18 or 19,
Mm-hmm.
mother me,
Yeah.
not not as an infant, but as an 18 or 19-year-old, and to take on the role of an engaged, loving
Yeah.
therapist slash mother
Yeah.
without being, without needing the impartiality, the
The
distance, the
distance. Yeah.
remoteness. I
Yeah.
needed a live
Exactly.
human being who
Mm-hmm.
would meet me head on, and she did. And I challenged her every way I could to try to defeat her. And she met me every way and showed that
Yeah.
that was not possible.
Yeah. You said in your book, you said she made it safe enough for me to attach.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah. So it
yeah.
was
Because I was
easy.
going to rebel against attachment because
Yeah.
I didn't trust it. and she, well, yeah,
Yeah.
she made it safe enough for me to attach.
Well, I have one more question, but before I ask, I want to read what you wrote because it was so touching to me. The fact that, the therapy really helped you and, like you said, saved your life. And you talk about your last session. It was our last session, the last time I would see Dr. Brandman. The only time I would say, the, the way maybe only a soldier gets to say, the way you get to say only once in your life, I owe you my life. There were tears in her eyes, empathy, gratitude, love. There were tears in mine. That is so beautiful.
Um, there are tears in my eyes now. She had the courage, and again, it was going against tradition. It was going against a lot
Mm-hmm.
of psychiatric lore to show me emotionally how she felt towards me and about the work we had done, about the
Yeah,
treatment that we were both involved. It wasn't my treatment; it was our treatment. She was in treatment with me just as I was in treatment with her. Different perspectives, different control, different issues. But I knew that she was alive with me in those moments, in those hours. And I needed that. I detachment and the surgical facade. It was. I just would just. I would. I would not would. I did. I walked out on it. It was like I
mm-hmm.
don't go to hell. No, I
Yeah,
don't.
yeah.
I no, it's not what I need. And
I
she provided a real live human
mm-hmm.
being
Very
who was
healing.
invested just as I was.
Yeah, yeah. To finish, so I was reading your book and I listened to an interview you gave and you were talking about the book and you said I thought I was searching for whys, but I found I was trying to release her. I imprisoned her soul. The book gave us freedom to just let us be. And my
I
last question is I had a friend of mine, he was a psychologist. And at the time, I wasn't a therapist, I was a journalist, and I studied a little bit of psychology, but I didn't know much. And I remember one day we were talking about his mom. And I said, "Oh, so what is your mom like?" And he said, "Oh, my mom is fine. It's the internal one that's problematic." And I remember looking at him and said, "What on earth is he talking about?" I had no idea what he was talking about. And in your book, you talk about the difference between narrative, the story you tell yourself, and then the biology, because you talk about how you were reborn, right? You had two dates, the day you actually were biologically born and then the day she died. And I was wondering, that's my last question. How did the book reshape the image of your mom to you? Both the mom that you talk about externally, but mainly the internal mother.
um it, again, it was one of the surprises of this book is that I didn't really anticipate how it would change my view of my mother. Because I didn't realize I was holding her a prisoner for many decades until I wrote this book. And in writing the book, I was able to release her and love her. I mean, at a certain point in time, as I was writing, I realized I was going to dedicate this book for Ruth. Ruth is my mother. And that moment was, again, something of an epiphany because it was like, I love her.
Hmm. You allowed yourself to say that.
It allowed me to love her cleanly
Yeah.
without, why did you do this? Why did you do that? How could you do this to me? All that stuff, all
Mm-hmm.
that, it's not about me. Had nothing to do with me.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
it allowed me to love her, and so I do,
Yeah.
which the internal mother finally is really good. And that just allowed me a huge amount of freedom that came late in my life. very late. I mean, late, I don't
It's never
I
late,
wasn't
right?
I wasn't in my
Yeah,
teens or 20s
yeah,
when
yeah.
that came. It was well beyond me, and that was a tremendous gift that the book gave, but that finally that my recognition of how much I owed
Mhm.
her, that just freed me. Freeing
Well,
her freed me.
yeah, I'm glad you did. And I'm glad you wrote the book. And I'm so glad you're here. Let me just say the name of the book. I will have the link on my notes. The book is called Life After Death: Surviving Suicide. So I'll have the link. It's out there for those of you who are interested. And I want to end by thanking you, Dr. Brockman, for coming here, for contacting me, and for giving us this beautiful gift, which is your book. Thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you for giving me this hour. It really was, again, a catharsis for me as well. It's a great learning. I appreciate it.
Thank
Thank you
you.
very much.